The Anishinaabeg migrated to the Great Lakes region from the Northeast long ago. Their oral traditions tell of a prophecy that told them to journey west until they came to a place where the food grows on water. Manoomin is a gift and always has been generous to those who care for it and use it in a respectful way.
I'm Darren Vogt. I'm Environmental Director at 1854 Treaty Authority, so I deal with all kinds of environmental issues as well as wild rice management. So wild rice grows from seed each year. So early in the spring, it'll sprout from the sediment of a lake and begin to grow. And then early in June, it reaches what's called the floating leaf stage, where it forms long ribbon-like leaves that float on the water surface. So this is a critical time for wild rice. If the water was to bounce high from a huge storm event or something, it can actually uproot the plants in that floating leaf stage. After floating leaf stage, it begins to stand out of the water, and that happens through July, essentially. And then in August, the plants start to flower and form the seeds on the end of the plants. So the seeds are what people can harvest, what wildlife use for food, and if they're not taken in those ways, they'll fall back in the sediment and be available for future wild rice growth. Well, wild rice is really adapted to disturbance, so it can have bad years. It can be wiped out by a storm or high water, for example, and the next year may bounce all back and be a good crop again. So wild rice is very variable across years. Wild rice is very beneficial to waterfowls, kind of the prime importance. Waterfowl use it for a food source throughout the season and during the fall migration. It's also important for erosion control, fisheries habitat. It's just part of a healthy ecosystem on the lakes and rivers. So we've done some work to develop an inventory of wild rice waters in the 1854 ceded territory, and our list sits at about 400 waters currently. So off that list, we've gone on those waters to do a general survey to see is wild rice present, how much wild rice is present, and general lake characteristics. So of those 400 waters, we've surveyed approximately 300. And so we kind of continue to develop this database and inventory of wild rice in the ceded territory. So a smaller subset of lakes, 10 lakes and rivers, we do more in-depth, we call it wild rice monitoring, where we track the density of wild rice each year. So each fall we do a more in-depth survey to identify how much wild rice acreage there is and how dense the wild rice is. So we've been doing that for approximately 18 years now, so we've got a long running history on these 10 waters on the change in wild rice across years. In a nutshell, what it is a grid of GPS points across the lake, and each point you do a half-meter square plot you place in the water and count how many rice stalks are within that plot. And then you also do some measurements on plant height. So between density and plant height, you can calculate a biomass for a lake. So really you're trying to track essentially wild rice abundance across years. We really think it's important for wild rice harvesters to get out and use the resource. We think you need people to care about the resource, to protect the resource, and to use the resource. So one thing we do on our website is we provide wild rice condition updates each season. Give an idea of how the wild rice is looking on lakes in the region. We provide pictures, both from on the ground and aerial photos as well. So we really try to give ricers some information on how the rice crop is looking each year. Threats to wild rice, water levels is kind of the big one, and some of that's ongoing management. Wild rice prefers shallow water, 1 to 3 feet typically, so any increases in water is usually not good for wild rice. So beavers are an ongoing issue, beaver management. We want to keep the water relatively low for wild rice. Other ongoing threats, climate change is probably a big one. We don't have a great handle on where things are going with that, but we're seeing increased storm events, for example, and that's not good for wild rice. Wild rice can be flooded out due to these big storm events. When the wild rice is standing like it is now, if we get big wind or hail, that can wipe out that year's rice crop. So the storm events are a big thing with climate change. Another issue with climate change is how does it kind of indirectly impact wild rice. Geese, for example, can have a big impact on wild rice in locations. So as climate change, we're seeing more geese present. What about diseases, fungal diseases like brown spot? We're starting to see that show up a little bit. How about rice worms? What does climate change do to rice worm presence? So you have all these indirect effects on wild rice that we really don't have a good handle on in relation to climate change. Other threats to wild rice are lake development. We're seeing more and more homes, cabins, resorts even on perhaps new lakes, shallower lakes that really maybe perhaps historically were less desirable. So people come in and build a cabin and then they want to change the character of the lake. They want deeper water for their boating and skiing and fishing like that. They want to remove all the vegetation, and so it's kind of an ongoing concern for wild rice is protecting these shallow bodies where wild rice really grows. And industrial discharges are possibly another threat to wild rice. Any changes to water quality or water quantity, so industrial releases can impact those things on wild rice as well. So the St. Louis River estuary in Duluth historically contained great areas of wild rice. There's stories about when you're canoeing through the estuary, you couldn't even see the river channel. You get lost because of how much wild rice. So currently that's not the case there. There's only remnant stands of wild rice left due to a variety of factors. So a number of partners have gotten together and decided, it's a good time to start to restore wild rice in the estuary. There's been a lot of cleanup happening, and things are really looking up in the estuary. So in 2014, a variety of partners worked together to develop a wild rice restoration implementation plan. Essentially, that outlined areas in the estuary that might be great to restore wild rice. They had the proper sediment, proper water depth, so really highlighted areas where we could restore wild rice. So in 2015, some of the restoration work actually finally took place. The 1854 Treaty Authority worked with a variety of partners, including the Fond du Lac Band, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Minnesota Land Trust, and Minnesota Pollution Control Agency were all partners on this. So in 2015, 5 different bays were seeded with wild rice. Fond du Lac Band gets the credit for acquiring all the seed they had. I think it was about 8,500 pounds of rice seed that went in the estuary. Even before that, Fond du Lac Band did some cutting to remove some existing vegetation to help wild rice kind of get a foothold in these restored areas. And so our role at 1854 Treaty Authority was to do the monitoring aspect of it to determine, how thick is the wild rice, and we can start tracking that over time. Is our restoration work successful? Is the wild rice being restored? Are we getting more abundant wild rice? So that's our main role in the project. And in 2016, those 5 bays were reseeded again, in addition to some additional spots. So we have 9 or 10 locations now in the estuary where we're working with a variety of partners trying to restore wild rice.